Okay, so elections and campaigns, basically, the first slide talks about nominations. Of course, we've talked before about how there's, of course, the primary election, which is when each party chooses its candidate for the general election, and then you go up to the general election, and basically the primary usually culminates in a nomination. Sometimes people just win the primary, but in the presidential race, there's an actual nomination at a national party convention, and it's sort of a big deal again. This happens through the primaries. The next slide talks about the Mcgovern-Fraser Commission. Formerly, the primaries were basically just considered to be advisory. In other words, candidates would run in the primaries, they would be elected, and they would win the primaries, but the primaries did not matter that much for the nomination. Party leaders would actually have a lot of say in who was actually going to be nominated at the national convention. In 1968, there were protests at the Chicago Democratic Convention because a lot of protesters felt like the Democratic Party was not representative. It was controlled too much by old white people, that there wasn't enough representation of women, not enough representation of minorities. And in particular, in 1968, there was a feeling that it wasn't critical enough of the Vietnam War, that it really wasn't representative of its actual constituents. So there were big protests that got a lot of attention, and there were police, there was actual violence, there were sort of riots to some extent. So responding to that, the Democratic Party said, okay, we need to answer these protesters, and we need to make the nomination process more transparent. What they're calling for is for the nominations to be more representative, but also more than anything for it to be more transparent. Let the people actually choose the representatives in the primaries rather than having party leaders do it somewhat in secret. So the easiest way to do that, the easiest way to make the whole process more transparent and at least potentially more representative, it was to make the primaries themselves the basis of the nomination. So whoever wins the primary essentially then becomes the nominee. Whoever wins all of the primaries, because of course each state has its own primary. So whoever wins all of the primaries essentially becomes the party's nominee, or whoever wins most of the votes in the primaries. And of course, different states have different amounts of delegates based on their size, just like electoral votes. So when the Democratic Party changed that, in most states, the election laws simply govern the primaries in general. So the Republican Party as well sort of switched in that way, and that's how primaries became so much more important. They went from being just, like I say, advisory, sort of the idea that they were advising the party leaders, but ultimately the party leaders made the real decisions, to becoming the real mechanisms by which the parties chose their nominees. So again, you run in the primaries in different states, and if you win the most number of delegates, and of course, again, different states have different numbers of delegates. Texas and California have more delegates than Rhode Island or Delaware. And if you win the highest number of delegates, then you're the party's nominee. But of course, even though we just pointed out that larger states have more delegates than smaller states, what really ends up being much more important is not so much the size of the state, but when it holds its primary. So the earlier in the primary cycle that you hold your primary, the more influential you're likely to be. So Iowa and New Hampshire are the first two primaries. Iowa is technically a caucus, but Iowa and New Hampshire are the first two primaries. They have enormous influence over the unfolding of the entire primary process. As the one slide said, in recent years, over a fifth of TV coverage of the nomination races have been devoted to the New Hampshire primary. So over 20% devoted to one state, a pretty small state in New England. It used to be considered better or more advantageous to have your primary later in the process, because then some candidates had been eliminated and you would have more influence. You would have more influence over actually choosing the final nominee. Whereas now, these early primaries are considered so important, they get so much attention that people tend to leave if they don't do very well. And so now having the earlier primary is considered more advantageous, and therefore there's been a kind of a race to have primaries earlier and earlier. This is called front loading. And of course, one of the problems here is that if candidates leave after these early elections, then they're not there in the later election. If Oklahoma, for instance, when Oklahoma had its primary in 2008, it didn't have nearly the same range of candidates to vote on as Iowa and New Hampshire did, because many of them had left. So it's in a sense less democratic, because again, not every state has the same range of candidates, the same range of options to actually vote on. Okay, and of course, as you might imagine, there have been significant criticisms of this long primary campaign. Again, because of this race to have primaries earlier and earlier, there's the primary cycle has been stretched out, because of course the general election is still in November, but people are having primaries now in January rather than in March or something when they used to start, when there used to be a much shorter primary system. So criticisms of the long primary campaign, first of all, obviously disproportionate attention goes to the early contests. In 2008, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, focused on Florida. He actually said he wasn't going to campaign at all in either Iowa or New Hampshire. He said these are not really representative states. Florida is a much more representative state, much more representative of the country as a whole, and much more typical of the kind of state that Republicans needed to win, he said. So he just ignored Iowa and New Hampshire altogether, and he focused all of his attention, all of his time, and all of his money on Florida. And in the Florida primary, he barely even got any votes at all. He fell flat on his face. It was a total disaster. It didn't work at all because he had ignored these early primary races, even though they were in different states, and he had been focusing all this time in Florida. He basically wasn't really noticed, even in Florida, where he had spent all this money on advertising, where he had spent all this time campaigning around the state. He basically wasn't noticed because so much national media attention goes to Iowa and New Hampshire. So, one criticism is too much attention is focused on these early campaigns. If you do poorly in Iowa, if you do poorly in New Hampshire, people tend to write you off right away, and obviously people are critical of this for obvious reasons. Also, because the campaign is so long, important politicians can't devote the time that they need to such campaigns. If you're a congressman or a senator or a governor, you actually already have a job. You don't necessarily have time to be traveling around the country for 8 months campaigning for president. Again, if the primary starts in January, of course, you don't actually wait until January to start campaigning. So you might spend, if you actually win the nomination, you might start campaigning in, say, November of 2011 or even before that, but you might start really seriously campaigning in November of 2011 and not stop until November of 2012. So if you have an important job, you don't necessarily have time to be doing that. So it either makes it more difficult for significant politicians to run, or it makes them not do their job as well. As the one slide points out, in 2004, 6 congressional Democrats ran in the primaries. They had a voting rate in Congress of 52%. The average is 90%. So running all this time obviously made it more difficult for them to do their job in Congress. Another criticism, money is too important. When you stretch out the primary like this, again, it costs much more to run a 5 or a 6 month primary campaign than it does to run a 2-month primary campaign. So then money becomes more important, and to some extent the person who wins, it's determined to a large extent by how much money they can raise. Another criticism is that primary participation is relatively low and unrepresentative. It's only about voter turnout is only about 20% in primaries. It's only 5% in caucuses, which are like town meetings, so they take more time. Iowa's the exception. Iowa's a caucus, but since it's the first one and it gets so much attention, voter turnout is more like 20% like it is in most primaries. So part of the argument is that primaries shouldn't be so important because voter turnout really is low and it's not representative. The people who do come out to vote tend to be somewhat more extreme than the people who will vote in the general election. And then the final major criticism is it gives too much power to the media because this long primary campaign, all of this stuff going on, basically it gives too much power to the media to focus on particular candidates, to hype them, to make them seem more exciting or more important. Okay, from the rest of the slides, the major thing is, what do campaigns mean? Well, we have PACs. These are political action committees. These are funding vehicles used by corporations, unions, and interest groups. They'll form a PAC to basically raise money and to give money to a candidate. So that's how these interest groups influence legislators and so on, as they form a PAC, a political action committee, and they deal with it that way. Your textbook talks more about this. The other major thing is the impact of campaigns. Surprisingly, given all this time, all this effort, all this money that goes into campaigns don't actually change that many people's minds. People tend to interpret what they see in a campaign to reinforce their own views. They either actually just reinforce their own views, or they ignore things that disagree with them. Campaigns change very few people's minds. Most people are not changed by campaigns, although that relatively small number that are changed, that can of course be the difference in a close election of a few percentage points. But overall, campaigns do not convert people. They don't change people's minds. They either reinforce what people believe or they energize a base.